Hi friends, welcome. I've had a strange day today. I was going to wrap up an edit for a video that I was going to share with you guys around photos that I took at a Renaissance fair. And that is still on the way, but I've realized something. Upon getting my new machine, which is a Windows machine, I have historically been a Mac user, but I switched over to Windows recently. And I've been dealing with all of the pains of shifting an operating system. I won't talk too much about why I switched. Part of it has to do with a sticky key on a new MacBook that I got. And I was like, you know what? I've been hearing some great things about Windows. I'd say they've really caught up in the space in terms of hardware and software, even though I would definitely consider Mac OS a superior operating system. Anyway, that's not what this video is about. You may notice that I'm shooting from a different angle today. I thought that would be fun. Here's more of my office. Just got some major upgrades, some new displays, one for me and one for my wife, some new desk accessories as well. But once again, that's also not what this video is about. As I was saying before I so rudely interrupted myself, I was wrapping an edit on a video today. I needed to export a bunch of photos from Lightroom and have them look the way that I wanted them to look. I realized that when I export photos from Lightroom on this new machine, they will look one way in Lightroom and one way out of Lightroom. So this turned into a big tech support issue where I had Adobe specialists, as they're called, remote using my desktop, trying to figure out what was going on. They were bringing up dialog boxes I've never seen before about graphics things. They were poking around in Lightroom. They were poking around in Photoshop. I had to restart my system twice. 3 times actually. This took hours out of my day. It was kind of necessary because it would have been a nightmare to export all of those photos and have to do that process of A/Bing them before and after and how they look in Premiere as I'm editing the video and that sort of thing. So I'm still figuring out that issue. Long story short, I'm going to share with you guys some advice. It's going to be a bit more of a topical video until I get all of that sorted out. Sometimes you guys leave really fantastic comments that are asking for help about a specific issue that you're dealing with. And whenever I see these comments, I go, oh my gosh, I could make a video about that. And I always know that these comments are a treasure trove of things that I could spend time on making videos about, but I don't do it as much as I would like to. Well, considering today's events, I decided a good idea would be to talk about a comment that I received on my New York City photo walk video. This very kind comment reads, amazing, amazing, amazing photos. I can't caps lock me. I guess I could yell. But another way to caps lock yourself is to emphasize. And a way to emphasize is to say a word 3 times. So amazing, amazing, amazing photos, exclamation point. I am a beginner film photographer and I'm interested in street photography. The thing is, I get nervous to shoot people, blah, blah. The thing is, I get nervous to shoot people because I take too much time getting the settings and the focus right. Would you have any tips? Also, beautiful color editing. Thank you so much for the kind words. This is a very good question. And to answer this question, I think it's a good idea to split things up into 3 different sections of the process of taking a photo of something or someone on the street. First, we have before the moment in which you would take a photo, then we have within the moment that you would take a photo, and then we have after the moment that you take a photo. And you might think, after you take the photo has already either been taken or not taken, so why does after matter? After does matter. Okay, first, before. It's a good idea before you go into a moment where you're going to be taking a photo on the street to get your settings roughly in line. You want to be in the right ballpark when you step into that moment. You want your exposure to end up roughly where you want it to be if you're shooting manual. If you're shooting aperture, this will take some of that thinking out of the mix, but we'll just say that you're shooting manual. I think it's a good idea to approach it that way because then you can get into the deepest level of intricacy that you may have to deal with while shooting. So a great example of a moment would be pretend you're in New York City and you're above ground and you're transitioning from above ground to below ground. You're going into the subway system where it's much darker, actually quite dark indeed. So your settings are probably going to be set up for a bright environment. Let's think about all of the settings that we're going to have to worry about in this equation. ISO, shutter speed, f-stop. Those are the basic ones. I mean, obviously we can get into like focus modes if you want to. I normally just shoot spot focus. And also we'll get into focusing in a second. Now, right now we're making technical and creative decisions about how we want our photo to turn out in the end. If you want your f-stop to be shallow so that you can let in more light but also have a shallower depth of field, maybe you want it to not be so shallow, but if you push the f-stop up and it's not so shallow, you're letting in less light, therefore you're going to have to push the shutter speed down more or the ISO up more and make some sacrifices. So what you want to try to do is probably find a happy middle ground for all of these. The subway is pretty dark, so the last time I was there I was finding myself pushing my ISO up to 1600, maybe even 3200 at times. And that's okay because I was totally down with some grain. You have to make that decision on your own. But that allowed me to have a shutter speed that was high enough that motion was not blurring too much. And of course, that if I was shooting handheld, which I was, that just the mere me holding the camera in my hand and the movement of my hand didn't make for a potentially more shaky photo. So I could have room to play around with the shutter speed as much as I wanted to. That way I could freeze motion as much as I wanted to, but also if I wanted to drop the shutter speed down a little bit so that I could have a bit more motion as the train comes by, for example, or what have you, then I could do that. That's what I mean when I say you're making both technical and creative decisions about how you want your photo to turn out in the end. Now we're still in before. We don't know exactly what's going to happen in the moment, but we're making approximations. We're trying to be roughly in the right space for when we enter the environment that we're going into. And if the exposure is a little dark or bright, most of my photos are way too dark. That's why you shoot raw. That's why it's a really good idea to shoot raw, and you can get away with a lot of things not going exactly to plan in terms of what you want your image to look like. You can fix a lot of that in post. There are certain things you can't fix in post, and one of those things is focus. Unless you have one of those, what was it, Lytro cameras that were supposed to be able to change crazy stuff. Anyway, that's not what we're doing. Focus. So far we have planned how shallow we want our depth of field to be. Now going into the moment, generally speaking, we want to hit focus. That's a good general rule, right? You can get away with missing it a little bit more if you're not in 1.8, right? You're shooting an f9. There's a lot more you can get away with, but generally speaking, ideally, we want to just hit focus on the subject. That's the goal, right? Now, there are a plethora of different ways to go about focusing in a street photography situation, and it definitely changes per situation, but then there's also things like zone focusing, but I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to focus on what I like to do when I go out to shoot. Now, I'm very curious how you guys go about focusing and what focusing modes you like to use. I just use spot focus. I tend to put that thing right in the middle. Every now and then I'll move it around, but I just put it right in the middle, and then I'll decide. I'm able to decide with finite control exactly where I want the focus to be. The way I shoot, I'm doing a lot of setting up beforehand and then letting the elements fall into place serendipitously for the photo to work. For example, if a train is coming through, I'll set focus where I want to where I want that train to end up being, right? When the train comes into that position, I take a photo, I have roughly perfect focus. Now, this is a great example of the importance of practice and shooting as much as possible. You want the camera to be an extension of your arm and your eye. You want to be able to whip the camera around, catch focus on one subject, catch focus on another thing. Things change very quickly, and you want to be able to aim it exactly where you need to very quickly. Now, some street photographers like a very high-speed approach where they put the f-stop at like f9, and they don't have to change the focus as much, and they're whipping the camera around. They're getting those like raw, close-up, wide, low-angle shots of people, very dramatic facial expressions, Eric Kim-esque. My style is to slow things down and design a scene and put the focus where it needs to be when things come together. And I'll shoot at f4 and sometimes f2.8. Also, being more specific with your focus comes into play more so when you're shooting long lens photography. You want your photos to feel more maybe cinematic or romanticized, and you want to nail it right on the person's eyeball. Now, one common issue that comes up with attempting to hit focus is if the subject is not there yet and you have nothing to focus on. In this case, I tend to focus on either the ground where the subject is going to end up, or I will focus on an object that's roughly an equal distance to me from what the subject is going to be. This is obviously easier if you give yourself more leeway with your f-stop. Oops, my computer went to sleep. Now let's include the other settings. One reason why it's a really good idea to shoot manual, it's not a rule, but it's a good idea, is because you probably want control of your f-stop, because that greatly influences the character of the final image if you're shooting at f9 versus f1.8. It's also a good idea to be in control of shutter speed because, for example, if you're shooting in aperture mode, that shutter speed, if you point in just the wrong direction, could go way down and you could end up with a very blurry image because your shutter speed dropped down way too low. If you get used to shooting in manual, you will learn that there are little spots that you can put that shutter speed where when you're outside, you're going to be roughly in the ballpark. When you're inside, you're going to be roughly in the ballpark. And ISO, especially if you're in a dark situation, you might want to allow the shutter speed to go down a bit more so that the ISO doesn't have to go up a bit more and you can have a bit more of a cleaner image. So a good strategy is to beforehand set yourself up to be in a position where when you're in the moment, you only have to worry about one setting for the most part, and that is your shutter speed. You can put yourself in a position where you just ride the shutter speed up and down according to what situation you're in. So if you're in a subway tunnel and you're moving from a darker point to a lighter point, let's say in the darker point you had your shutter speed down to 1/50th of a second, assuming your lens would let you do that without it getting, too, like if you're shooting with like a 250 millimeter lens, you might struggle at a 1/50th of a second. But when you move into a lighter part, you might be able to push that up a little bit more, freeze the motion a bit more, and keep the exposure where you want it. But then if you move back into a darker situation, let's say that darker situation is even darker than the last situation, if you set yourself up properly, a lot of times, not all the time, but a lot of times, you won't have to touch the ISO. You can just bring the shutter speed down, and it might be a little dark, your resulting image, but that's okay. You can fix that in post as long as you don't go too crazy with it. Okay, so this after bit that I mentioned. After could mean two things. After could mean after you take a photo and you're still out, but you're just kind of looking through what you have. That's okay. Just know that you can miss stuff when you do that. Happens to me all the time, and that a lot of times is a better idea just to keep shooting. But you can learn on the fly from looking at what you have, and you can also gain context to how successful your photo walk has been. So there's that after, but then there's after, and that's back when you get home and you're in Lightroom or you're editing the photos on your phone, what have you. And you're able to sit with them and pay attention to what went right and what went wrong, and analyze your photos. Spend some time with them, meditate with them. Out of the 100 photos I took, why did these 95 not work? What about them did not quite come together? A lot of times it has to do with you not being present or you not pushing yourself to get that photo. maybe a little less to do with settings, but sometimes it does have to do with settings. Sometimes you missed focus, and sometimes you drug the shutter too much to the point that the photo went from just being like really nice and abstract to what is that thing there? So the name of the game is to, before, in the moment, and after, do that over and over and over again for years and years and years, and you might make a photo that's good. There are two important points that I want to touch on. One, I want to double down on what I mentioned a second ago around being present, not having your face buried in the camera or being too much in your head, that you're not going with the flow of everything that's happening around you, that you're not just keeping your head on a swivel and watching the dynamics as they unfold, being there, being ready for when things happen. There's a certain flow state that you can get into, and that's when street photography gets really fun. You hit that flow state, and then you grab a photo that you feel really good about. You're like, oh my gosh, that one really worked. That's a great place. The other thing is commit to photos. If you see an opportunity, go after it. Don't be hesitant. Don't be anxious. If your settings aren't quite right, pull the camera up and start shooting anyway. Get those hesitancy triggers out of your mind and be fully committed to creating in the moment. And of course, do it a lot. Everybody is a photographer these days, but not everyone is a great photographer. And the thing that separates a photographer from a great photographer is hours. Okay, that's it. I hope you guys found that helpful. That was a fantastic question. I have videos on the way. I'm working on that Renaissance Fair video that I mentioned at the beginning. And I'm also working on a photo walk that happened downtown Salt Lake City, here where I live here. And that will be on the way as well. Hopefully I can get my technical issues in order and things become easier and I don't have to switch back to Mac. I was really considering it today. It was a mess. But Adobe tech support, you were incredibly helpful. Thank you for all the clarifying answers you gave me. Thanks for watching. Oh, you can find me on Instagram. Feel free to engage with me on there. Send me a message. I love interacting with you guys in that way. And if you leave a comment asking about something that I mentioned here, something about my process below, that would be super awesome and might turn into another video. Okay, goodbye.